All right, good afternoon. Making sure the recording feature is on here. Politically incorrect old white man here again. And today I'm going to address the issue of the Afrikaner quote unquote refugees that's causing such a firestorm in the media in the United States. So, as I've said before, I'm South African. But I'm not an Afrikaner. Afrikaners are a subset of the white population of South Africa that were there, have been there longer than most of the rest of us who arrived somewhat later and are collectively known as the English speakers. Some of which are not English at all, descended from the English, but came from various countries such as Lebanon, Italy, uh, and Scotland, et cetera, et cetera, um, and are not Afrikaners, English, typically English speakers. Having said that, all South Africans learn to speak both languages, um, and I spent a good deal of time immersed in the Afrikaner community and culture and language during my time in the military and subsequently through personal relationships. And then over the years that I've been out of the country, I've returned numerous occasions for visits, and in the most cases, I've spent time with Afrikaner hosts. So I am very, very familiar with their story, their mentality, and their situation. So the big fuss appears to be that these people are not the subject of any kind of treatment that would entitle them to refugee status. They're certainly not, according to these media reports, they're certainly not suffering a genocide. Well, there's a grain of truth to that, as there is in all propaganda, but let me give you the full story. First off, no one's alleging that Afrikaners are being butchered by the hundreds or thousands on a daily basis. That's not what anyone is saying. What people are saying is that there is a creeping genocide, and that looks like it may escalate. And that's in the physical sense. There's also an economic genocide going on in the sense that these people are being deprived of their livelihood and now of their property, or legislation. The legislative groundwork is being laid to deprive them of their property. And given those two looming threats, they are deserving of refugee status in the United States. Let's talk about the physical violence and the genocide. For the last 25 or more years, there have been sporadic and violent and vicious murders of mostly Afrikaner farmers on remote farms. In some cases, no property being taken. In many cases, vicious torture being meted out to these people using burning ovens. There are cases where babies have been roasted alive in ovens using electric drills. That's a favorite tactic. Take an electric drill, drill a hole in the person's kneecap until they give you the keys to the safe or wherever the valuables are stored. And rape of women, rape of children in front of parents, gang rape, vicious beatings, and the like. So this is not just common everyday criminal activity, which is what the media would like you to believe. Yes, there's lots of criminal activity in South Africa directed at all races. The other thing is they'll tell you as well, the vast majority of victims of crime are black. Well, the vast majority of the population is black, and the farmers form a very small minority of the white population. Even within that definition. There are something like 25,000 farmers, white farmers in South Africa is the number I've heard. And when you look at the prevalence of crime relative to the number of white farmers, I've seen statistics that say that if you're a white farmer, you're 4 times as likely to be murdered as if you are anybody else in the country. So, you know, there are some facts that the media don't like to mention. The brutality, the apparent lack in many cases of an economic incentive. It appears to be pure political intimidation. The agenda is they want the whites off the land, specifically the white farmers, because land is the big contentious issue in that part of the world. Which brings me to the second aspect of this whole thing, which is the economic genocide. Going back to the early days of the ANC regime, the government introduced legislation which discriminated against whites in all spheres of life. Good luck getting into a university if you're white. Good luck getting a government contract if you're white. Good luck getting hired by a corporation if you're white, et cetera, et cetera. The legislation specifically requires these institutions to favor Black people, which they categorize as formerly disadvantaged, which has, again, a grain of truth to it. But the fact remains is that the policy of Black economic empowerment is discriminatory against white people. And for that reason, many of these Afrikaners who traditionally, if they were not farmers, worked for state-owned companies like the airways, the railroad, the telecommunications company, or they worked for the state directly as government employees. Many of them, almost all of those jobs have gone. They've been replaced by ANC supporters who, as evidenced by the collapse of the economy and all of the state-owned enterprises, including the airline, the railroad, et cetera, are not qualified to fill those jobs. So they've been pushed out into an informal economy where many of them have started small businesses and gone into various bizarre or fringe forms of employment, such as professional hunting, mercenaries. You'll find South African mercenaries in the Middle East and all over the world. These people have to do what they have to do to make a living. The next step in the economic genocide is this legislation which strips away their rights to their personal property that's provided for in the Constitution. They specifically now introduced legislation which enables the state to confiscate their property pretty much on a whim without compensation. Up to this point, there was a system of, or there was a legal process which has now sunsetted that dealt with the land question. If a disadvantaged group were able claimed that they owned or had a right to a farm or a piece of land, and that they'd been deprived of that right under the prior administration, they or their ancestors, they made claim in the courts, and the courts would, if that claim had merit, the court would award them that land, restitution of the land. In I think almost all cases, they were offered the option of taking money or being able to move back onto the land. And in many, many cases, the vast majority, I can't quote a statistic, they opted to take money. The government would buy, regardless of what they opted, the government would buy the land at a fair market price from the current title holder, and then hang on to the ownership. They never redistributed any land. The government kept all of that property in their name, which is one of the reasons the statistics that everyone spouts of the whites own 70% of the private land is so skewed. A huge chunk is owned by the government, and that's not part of the denominator in that equation. So if you just talk about all land in South Africa, the whites do not own 70% of it, far from it. They own a minority of it. The biggest landowner in South Africa is now the state, including the former homelands, or in the American context, that would be the reservations. They're all owned by the state, in addition to hundreds of thousands of farms that were purchased under this land reform program, which is now sunsetted. The problem, one of the problems with the land reform program is it was a disappointment. It did not deliver what the ANC promised it would, which was, chicken in every pot, or a farm for every black person, which was a unrealistic promise in the first place. And even if they were able to deliver it, that was would have been a disaster for the economy. Everybody knows that your average black guy, if you gave him the farm, would not be able to farm it. He doesn't have the know-how, doesn't have the capital, and culturally, black farming is subsistence farming, not commercial farming. So it would have been a disaster. The government ran out of money to buy these farms. So now, in order to placate the voters, and they're losing support, as evidenced in the recent election, where they lost their majority, they are now promising, continue to promise land for everybody, which they can only get by seizure without compensation. So that's what's behind that whole thing. So now that the Afrikaners have basically been thrown out of the formal economy, they're now about to get thrown off the one sector of the economy where they still do very well, which is the farming sector. They're excellent farmers. They have been farmers for generations. They feed Southern Africa. They're extremely productive and good farmers. One can argue with, the fact that one man owns so many thousand hectares, and that doesn't seem to be fair, but that's the reality of the modern agricultural practice. You can't have a whole little array of little postage stamps. Now let's look at precedents for this seizure of private property around the world in recent history. The obvious one is Zimbabwe, where again the farmers were targeted, thrown off their farms without compensation. Some of the best farms, in fact, most of the best farms, ended up in the hands of high government officials or military or police officials, which treated them, some cases, they continued farming, usually hiring displaced white farmers to do the farming for them. But in many cases, they just became rundown weekend places. Then there was a bunch of marginal farms that were taken, that were divided up into, I believe, 5-hectare and 10-hectare pieces. If you were a veteran, bona fide veteran of the Bush Wars, and you fought for the black liberation movements, you got a slightly bigger piece of land. Otherwise, you got a 5-hectare piece, which is, a hectare is 2-point-something acres. So, 10 to 20 acres of land. And then you were entitled to go build your hut on that piece of land and have 3 chickens and 4 goats, and, basically live in poverty, but supposedly in bliss on this land. Well, of course, a lot of those people, after 1 year, just packed up and moved back to the city. And the farms that were handed over were badly stripped of pumps, any kind of equipment, water pumps, irrigation equipment, and fell into disuse. As a consequence, Zimbabwe's food production basically collapsed. They were a very strong producer of food in Southern Africa, and tobacco and other crops. Their agricultural economy collapsed almost entirely, and the only way the country survived was on foreign food aid for many decades. So that's the obvious precedent right there, and a very recent one. There have been others in history, though. Let's go back to Germany during the Nazi times. The Jews were subject to confiscation of their businesses and private property. There was a process called Aryanization, where if you were a Jewish business owner, you had to have an Aryan partner or owner or co-owner in the business, or the Aryan partner would then take over your business entirely, the ownership of it, and you were not compensated. This is very much what's anticipated and practiced in South Africa today, where one of the provisions of Black economic empowerment legislation is that any business that employs a certain number of people or has a turnover in excess of a fairly low threshold has to have Black shareholders, which own, I believe it's 30% of the business, and typically what is meant by Black shareholders is politically connected persons, and that's how some small number of politically connected people in South Africa have become immensely rich overnight. So there you have Nazi Germany, and of course, what happened to the Jews is step two was, I think, even the liberal media would admit, was a genocide. So, you know, when they take your stuff and start treating you like a second-class citizen, what often follows is they take your life. The same process occurred in Cuba, where wealthy people were deprived of their land, farmland in many cases, but also any kind of valuable asset. Foreign investors were thrown out and deprived of their property. And political dissidents were lined up and shot, some by Fidel Castro himself with his own pistol. So again, the precedent is once they start taking your personal property, they're pretty soon going to take your life as well. That's Cuba. Russia, the same thing happened, the same story. We all know that Stalin orchestrated the death of millions of people. We all know that farms were collectivized and confiscated from wealthy families and operated as collectives. It's the same old playbook that's now being followed in South Africa. And again, death followed deprivation. There's other examples, China, where the land was confiscated from wealthy landowners and divided up among the peasantry. And that became such a disaster that Mao had to order the peasants to kill all the birds because the birds were eating what little food was produced, and you know, the country was on the brink of starvation. So there are a lot of historical precedents that once they start with this agenda, it ends up in a true genocide. And having said that, there are some people smarter than I that have studied genocides, and they characterize the genocide as not as an event, but a process that follows 10 stages. Many of the preparatory stages are evident in South Africa. You know, conditioning public opinion, villainization of the class that's targeted for genocide, confiscation of their firearms, which is another thing that the ANC did almost immediately when they got into power, as they severely limited private ownership of firearms, and now there's some move afoot to confiscate the privately held firearms that remain. So all of this doesn't bode well for the Afrikaner people, and the smart ones are reading the writing on the wall. And believe me, it's not an easy decision for them because they're emotionally invested in South Africa, and in fact, in their religion, which is Calvinism, and that's one of the reasons they were chased out of Europe back in the late 1600s, early 1700s. They believed that they were sent to South Africa by God, that God, they're there for a reason, and it's very difficult for them to stomach leaving South Africa, and it's a very painful process. I can attest that it's not easy to if you're an adult or a young adult to leave the country of one's birth and to start over in a strange country. It's easier for me. I was English speaking, educated in the United States partially, But for these people, it's a huge leap. And it's just a shame to see these people, these talking heads, mocking them, deriding them, goading them, suggesting that they should come and pick fruit because the Trump administration is kicking out the South Americans that are doing the fruit picking right now. That's really what's going on. It just sticks in the craw of the liberal left that Trump is letting some true refugees into the country that happen to be white, while at the same time expelling people that are fraudulently claiming refugee status with, and in many cases involved in criminal activity in the United States. So that just sticks in their craw. As far as the South African government is concerned, they have mixed feelings about the Afrikaners leaving. There is a wave of sentiment that's encouraged by the government against whites in South Africa. They're characterized as settlers and colonizers, and those are almost words of derision. And that they're constantly told they should go back to Europe or go back to Holland. The South African government, on the one hand, many of the politicians and many of the useful idiots are happy to see these people leave. They just say that's one fewer Afrikaner we have to drive into the sea, or one fewer that we have to hack to death. And presumably they aspire to take whatever possessions these people left behind. On the other hand, the whites in general and the Afrikaners in particular pay the vast, even though they're a minority population-wise, they pay the vast majority of taxes collected by the ANC government. In fact, they are almost single-handedly supporting the government. So this is a worrying development for them. If all these productive people, taxpayers, up and move to America, or if a good chunk of them up and move to America, that will just accelerate the economic collapse in the country. It's really a train wreck already. It's just held together by hook or by crook. And this will be the final coffin in the nail in the coffin. So that's why the South African government is conflicted about these people leaving, and all they've been able to do so far is to pile on with comments such as these are cowards, and to deny, of course, the genocide. Nobody on the left, certainly the South African government, doesn't want to be recognized as a genocidal government, or a government that tolerates a genocide, or that is engaged in racist practices. And nobody on the liberal left in the Western world wants that to happen either, because in their mind, South Africa is this wonderful new, once evil place that is now, a democratic society, and it's a wonderful turnaround to be celebrated. They don't want any black marks on the history books as far as genocides and racist practices are concerned. So that's why the left-wing media is that's why their heads are exploding over the arrival of these Afrikaners. To the Afrikaners, I would say this. What you have done is a good thing, and in 10 years' time, you will think back and reflect that this was the best decision you could have made. I certainly feel that way. It will be difficult. It takes about 5 years to assimilate into a culture that's on the surface not too different than your own, but believe me, it is different. So it'll take you 5 years just for that stress associated with being in a strange culture in a strange place to subside until you feel comfortable. You will meet many Americans who are genuinely friendly and welcoming. You will also meet some twisted people who have preconceived notions about you, who see you as, nothing more than a Nazi who fled Germany after the Second World War to whatever country. Nothing that you say or do can change their mind. I experienced some of that from some highly educated people in some highly respected educational institutions. And then you'll encounter a lot of people who just are oblivious. They don't even know where South Africa is. They think South Africa is like South America. They don't think it's a country. They think it's kind of a continent, and they want to know which country you're from in South Africa and such ignorant questions. But anyway, keep your nose clean, work hard. You will fit into society, and you will, above all, you will sleep peacefully at night, and your children will benefit immensely from the decision you have taken. That's all I have to say on the subject. And once again, thank you for watching. If you watched through to the end, I hope you found this interesting and informative.